Hello and welcome back to Alfred's Basic Adult Piano Course, Lesson Book, Level 1. This video is Lesson 54, and we're going to have a short lesson today on page 61. We're going to talk about measuring half steps and whole steps, and also tetrachords. Now this is actually something that's going to help you a lot with our next lesson, which is going to be 55 on page 62. So kind of think of this as part 1 and part 2 in a way. But half steps and whole steps is something you really want to have a good understanding of on the piano, and it's not difficult at all. A half step is simply the distance from any key to the very next key above or below. Now we just talked about flats in our previous lesson, lesson 53, and earlier in the book we talked about sharps. And when you have a sharp, you go to the very next key to the right. Well, that's actually called a half step when you go to the very next key to the right. Likewise with flats, you go to the very next key to the left. That's also a half step. It's just, you could say sharps is a half step up, flats is a half step down. Okay, so there's no key in between. So on page 61, the very top where it says half steps, it's the distance from any key to the very next key above or below, black or white. It also says above the diagram, half steps, there's no key between. So let's look at middle C. And you can also look at the diagram there. If I go a half step up above middle C, I'm really going to C sharp. Now you can also call that D flat. What a lot of musicians will think of as C sharp because I went up to the right. You know, remember, flats go up. No, let's not get it confused. Sharps go up, flats go down. Sharps go to the right, flats go to the left. Okay, so if I'm starting on a C and I go up a half step, a lot of people will automatically call that C sharp. But if you say D flat, you're not wrong either. This key actually has more than one name. So even from there, if I go up another half step, that would actually be D. Okay, so you can even go from from a black key a half step up or down. And if I go a half step up from D, D sharp. Again, it could also be E flat, but tend to think of it as sharps when I'm going this direction. From D sharp, if I go up a half step, it's an E. And from an E, if I go up a half step, it's an F. Yeah, you could also call it an E sharp in some cases, but F will do just fine. So that's going up by half steps, but again, I could go down by half steps. I could go from F to E, E to E flat. So just no skipping of any keys. That's a half step, okay? So if I'm going to count half steps, for example, how many half steps between C and E? So the way to do that would be, well, C to C sharp is a half step. So remember, it takes two keys to make a half step, okay? You can't say this is 1 and this is 2. It's not like steps that we did earlier in the book. We're actually progressing beyond that. Think of those steps as sort of an introduction. This is where it gets down to the real stuff. So this is a half step. It takes two keys, okay? Remember that. It takes two keys to make one half step. So there's one half step, two half steps, three half steps, four half steps. So the distance from C to E is 4 half steps. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how you could measure half steps. You can pick any key on the piano and just practice, you know, going down a half step. Hey, what's down a half step? Well, it's next key down. It's really not difficult. D, next key up. You know, that's a half step. So the entire piano, it's really easy to do half steps. Now let's look at whole steps at the middle of the page. Now a whole step is equal to 2 half steps. You think about half and a half equals a whole. So it's really not that difficult either. It can get confusing though with the layout of the white and black keys as this diagram shows. So it says there one key between, okay? We just said C to C sharp is a half step, okay? C to D is a whole step, one key in between, okay? You can look at it in 2 ways. A whole step, you could say there's a key in between, or you could go up 1 half step, 2 half steps. Music is math, right? So there's your whole step. From D to E is a whole step. I've skipped this black key. But this is where you could get confused and say, okay, E to F is a whole step. No, E to F sharp is a whole step. I have to skip a key, whether it's white or black. E to F is a whole step. So again, it's not the steps that you learned earlier in the book. It's not all these white keys. Yes, those are just basic steps, but we're going beyond that now. And that kind of language, steps in general, is just going to be dismissed. Now, you need to be specific. You specifically need to think of half steps and whole steps when you're working on piano. Then the reason for this is we're getting into more sharps and flats. So when you get into sharps and flats, you're getting into black keys, and that's really getting very specific with our step movement. All right, so once again, whole steps. E to F sharp is a whole step. So from an F sharp, if I want to go up a whole step, it's going to be G sharp, right? Because I've got to skip a key, in this case, the G key. G sharp to A sharp, that's a whole step. I'm skipping a key. From A sharp, a whole step up would be C, right? Because I'm skipping this key. And then from C to D would be a whole step, just like the beginning of the diagram. So again, half step, the very next key to the right or left. Whole step, you either skip a key to the right or left, or think of it as 2 half steps. Okay, so half steps, whole steps, that's something you really, really need to know. Tetrachords, this is good to know, but this is leading in specifically to our next lesson, lesson 55. In my experience, yes, it's good to know a tetrachord. It's good to know as much information as you possibly can. If you don't know this for the rest of your life, you can be just fine at piano. Whole steps and half steps, I recommend you know that. The tetrachords, it's not as important, but let's go through what a tetrachord is. A tetrachord is a series of 4 notes having a pattern of whole step, half step. You just have to memorize that. 4 notes having that pattern. Okay, so if I start on C, follow the pattern. Whole step up from C is D. Whole step up from D is E. And finally, a half step is F. So there's our 4 notes, C, D, E, F. That is a tetrachord. Why is C, D, E, F a tetrachord? Again, because it's 4 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, following the pattern of whole step, half step. Now, of course, it works anywhere on the piano. I can do it on a G. 4 notes, whole step, there's 2 notes, another whole step, I've got my 3 notes, another, a half step, there's my 4 notes, a tetrachord. Sometimes it gets more confusing than that. I could start on, let's say, B flat, but it still works. Just be very careful when you go through the process. A whole step from B flat is C. A whole step from C is D. And a half step from D is E flat. So there is a tetrachord built off of B flat. Okay? Now it should sound nice and pretty. If your tetrachord sounds like this, it's probably wrong. Okay? So that's the other thing. Tetrachords sound pretty pleasant. At least when played individually. If you play them all together, it's not, it's questionable. But it's definitely not something like this. Okay, that's just hideous. So, you can see in the diagram, C, D, E, F, how that works on the keyboard, how it looks also on the staff, and specifically the treble clef staff. So that's basically it for this lesson. Half steps, whole steps, tetrachords. And again, make sure you do memorize and have a clear understanding of what they are before going on to lesson 55.